Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Pearsall. I am the community manager here at Committee for Children and the SEL education community, and I am really glad to be able to join you all for the latest in our SEL education speaker series. Today, we're going to be talking about the ways that people can fund social emotional learning programs, specifically funding in the United States, a topic that is near and dear to many educators' hearts. But before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Committee for Children's offices sit on the unceded traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, Washington, the Duwamish tribe. As we honor the people and their ancestors, it's also important that we consider our place in the past, present, and future history of the indigenous peoples of our region, as well as how we can best support them. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce to you today's guest, Joany Higgins. Joany is Education Partnerships Manager at Committee for Children and an awesome champion of social emotional learning and supporter of educators across the United States. Joany, welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really glad to be here and really excited to join with so many wonderful champions in the Facebook community today.
And there we go. I push a button. Sorry. I'm going to start off by kind of thing in general. For those that are new to funding social emotional learning initiatives, what are some of the common sources of funding that people use?
Yeah, great question, Matt. So I think we hear of many common funding sources for social emotional learning, and they really do vary depending on the area, the region. But I think what is folks tend to be most aware of is the federal funding. So that is going to range from Title I, which is generally what folks are utilizing most. And many of the title funding sources are often a common source of SEL funding, but it also federal funding also looks across a wide spectrum. Another place that folks are often turning to in federal funding is SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have a variety of block grants. Those are generally funding primary prevention programs, so social emotional learning fits really well into that and is a common place that schools and districts are going to utilize often long-term and multi-year SEL initiative funding. Project Aware is also another common source through SAMHSA that is focused on advancing wellness and resilience in education. And it's usually a funding source in collaboration with states, but a really common federal source of SEL funding. Looking to other state funding, definitely basic per pupil funding is a pretty common SEL source. We're often hearing of prevention and intervention grants at the state level as well. And if districts are in a rural location or more remote location, that rural education grants and funding sources can often be tapped into for social emotional learning. Local funding, of course, is going to vary by place, but things like block grants, levy funds, city and county funding are often tapped into. But I think what we're hearing the most and a really strong place for schools and districts to turn to is around private funding. And that's going to predominantly be foundation funding. Again, it's going to depend a bit on your location. So it may be a foundation that's in your community, really focused on education within your own school or district. But there are some funders that work more at a regional or national level. A few that we've heard of that are really big in the SEL space are the Lilly Endowment, Prevention Matters. I've heard from some districts that are working with their local Kiwanis chapter. Also state community foundations. They often have a K-12 or education portfolio within their kind of broader community foundation funding stream. Another one is the Children's Trust. That's often a state level focus, and they're one that funds a lot of SEL initiatives, especially around early learning. So quite a bit in there. I know from federal to state, often something our districts are thinking a lot about, but I encourage folks to also look really in that community partnerships. Where are those local funders, specifically those private funders? And just in terms of kind of how to identify those grants, utilizing things like grant list databases. GrantWatch is a great one, grants.gov. Those are great places to turn to really look at all of those different funding sources I just mentioned.
That's a lot of different, there's a lot of different places people can look. There's also stuff that's available kind of right now that districts are tapping into at this very moment, some stuff tied around um, like COVID relief grants and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the sources that are available, like at this very moment, the districts are using right now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in addition to that long list I just mentioned, you are exactly right, Matt, really utilizing the funds available that the government has provided to give relief to schools and districts is a really powerful and predominant way to fund SEL right here, right now. Of course, includes things like the CARES Act and the CRRSA Act. Those just broadly support initiatives related to SEL, but a portion of that has also been set aside to support ESSR funds, and that's ESSR and ESSR2 funds, and that is the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. And those were set aside specifically to address the impacts of COVID-19 and ongoing continued impacts on schools and districts. So we know that with what our school communities have been through, if we are looking to support that learning recovery and well-being of students and educators, we know that that SEL focus is going to fit really well into that funding focus. And I'll also note that the American Rescue Plan of 2021 specifically called out social emotional learning. So they want to support learning. They've set aside funds specifically to support learning recovery, and they mentioned that funding should be focused on activities and interventions that respond to students' academic, social, and emotional needs. So we are hearing that language kind of front and center in there. And just to point folks in a direction of where to go to find out more about that, because I think, as you mentioned, it's really front of mind for folks right now, is our colleague Jordan Passamentier, our incredible Director of Policy and Advocacy, has put together a great blog post. I highly encourage folks to take a look at that, and that dives really deeply into this funding stream around the CARES Act, around ESSER funds, and you can learn more about what those funds look like, how to use them for SEL in that blog post. I think, Matt, we might have the link to that. I don't know if we can
I'll throw that up in the chat
Good.
right now, wherever you're at. If you don't see it right away, you'll see it in just a minute or two.
Great. And I'll just also mention, outside of that kind of federal funding source, we're hearing a lot about well-being. We know that with what our school communities have gone through in this last year plus, the focus on student well-being, educator well-being is so important. And our funders are really hearing that and looking to fund that need. So I think that's also been a common area of funding kind of in this right here, right now moment that districts and schools can look to support their social emotional learning initiatives. It also is a great focus to think about SEL for adults, because if we're thinking about well-being of the entire school community, we can really think about how the well-being of our educators can be supported through the bolstering and building of their own social emotional competence and really ability to bring that and model that into the classroom.
Cool. So are there other things the district should consider when looking for funding?
Well, I think this will resonate with you, Matt. I think the power of community, the power of network is really incredible in this work around funding, because so much of what is learned in how to find funding, where to go, what funders are in the SEL space really comes from having conversations around it. So this incredible community here, I'm hopeful will be a source for folks to turn to hear where others in the US are finding their funding, really having those conversations with each other as champions of SEL, as champions of supporting these initiatives, and really turning to district partners as well, seeking insight from other districts in your location, kind of your region, turning to other contacts you have in the field. That community networking can be really powerful in finding funding. That is how we here at Committee for Children learn a lot about grants as well. I really build that into many of the conversations I have with schools and districts, understanding both what are their barriers to funding and where are they turning in terms of finding funding for these initiatives. Another thing to think about is really thinking broadly about how these initiatives are funded. So of course, finding those funders that specifically address SEL is fantastic. We know that they are going to be, wanting to fund these initiatives, but there's also some really great space to look outside of just explicit SEL funding. We think about kind of the power of kind of those integrated initiatives that align well to SEL. So things like mental health, I mentioned primary prevention, substance abuse prevention, wellness, I mentioned, trauma-informed practices. Those can all be really great ways that are looking to broadly support students, and in that can be really great sources for that specific SEL universal classroom curriculum or SEL program. Another plug for a great resource around that, if you're kind of wondering how SEL can fit in with those other initiatives, is turning to the policy papers that our policy and advocacy team have put together. Those tie those SEL initiatives really nicely into some of these interconnected and aligned initiatives, that many of which I just mentioned. And those are great places to both understand what other initiatives might be helpful, as well as to use in the actual application process. So if you are finding that grant that focuses on well-being and you want to connect it back to SEL, those policy papers can really help you find the research, really build some of that content out for the application itself.
That's great, and I'm posting those policy paper links in the chat as well, so that you can take a look at them. And then if you're not seeing it, like if you're on YouTube and I haven't had a chance to get them to you yet, I'll put them there after the fact. So don't worry, we'll get those to you wherever you happen to be watching this. So what are some of the other trends that you're seeing in SEL funding right now?
Yeah, so kind of a small collaborative of us here at Committee for Children did a small survey to some district leaders that are working on SEL funding, whether leading those SEL funding initiatives at their district or supporting it. And we got some really great insight from that survey. One of which is that grant sizes that our districts are applying for around SEL really vary. Some districts are looking for these large multi-year SEL funding initiatives that can support their broad, sustainable, long-term SEL initiative. And others are looking more at a school-by-school rollout. So they might be finding funds for a single school, and then next year they're applying for another small grant to fund the next school. So there's a lot of variance in what folks are looking for and who they're going to fund it. And we also got some great insight on what the process looks like for districts. Again, there was some variation in what folks saw, but for the most part, the bulk of time that these district leaders were spending around funding was in identifying grants. So kind of brings us back to the beginning of our conversation and looking both at the resources available to find funding, as well as really tapping into that community, because we know that time is limited. All of your plates are incredibly full. So if you can take some of that time off and actually finding the grant by talking to others and hearing what grants are available that folks are using, that can hopefully make this lift a little lighter. And then, of course, I think what may resonate with many of you is that outside of the identification process of finding the grant, the application process can be a bulk of time. That really can take a lot of time. So we'll share out before we wrap up today some resources that might hopefully help that process in at least knowing what resources are out there to support you in writing these grants and putting these together to reduce some time in that too. And then outside of that survey, which really kind of heard from specific district leaders, I think there's also a strong focus on professional learning. I think this is something you're likely hearing as well, Matt. It's just professional learning around SEL is front of mind for folks. A renewed focus on supporting that well-being of our educators, our school communities, and providing opportunities for educators to further their own SEL competence, to be able to strongly model these skills in the classrooms to really bolster either existing SEL initiatives for students in the classroom, or to weave into new initiatives that schools are planning for that explicit instruction. So this is a great place for where our SEL adults focus can be thinking about how we're supporting the educators' social emotional well-being and competence. And this also opens up some new funding sources too. Many of the funding streams I mentioned are really explicitly focused on how we're supporting students. So thinking about how we're supporting educators around professional learning can potentially open up some new funding streams. Potentially new funding around private grants that are looking specifically to support educator training or professional learning, as well as a federal funding source, Title IIA, which focuses on preparing, training, and recruiting educators and leaders. So that can be a great place to go. And again, just a little different. If you're used to funding SEL for students specifically, you now have some additional resources in terms of professional learning as well.
And you mentioned before kind of that once you've identified the grant, you got into, then the next step is to do the grant writing process. What are some of the common steps in the grant writing process?
Yeah, absolutely. So it will look a bit different depending on what the funding source is. Those of you who have applied for a grant or used federal funding know that kind of one grant is one grant, and you move on to the next, and it may look a little different in the process. But as you mentioned, it definitely starts with that common point: finding the grant, identifying that funding source. It may be that you're finding multiple funding streams. Maybe you're focusing on one grant for elementary, one grant for middle school. So you may have a few identification of steps in that process. And then the bulk of the work happens in the writing of the grant, the application process. You're putting together your narrative, you are really telling the story of both the need for this SEL initiative, kind of the what and the why, as well as your project plan or program outline for what this is going to look like, timeline for when it will happen. And the next part is really the exciting part. That's the receiving of the grant. You have been awarded the funds.
Woohoo!
The great news that your initiative has been funding. But I will say that even if you haven't been awarded the grant, there's still some really great information to be obtained from hearing that unfortunately your fund wasn't awarded, because often funders will share with you, especially if it's a private foundation or a private funding source, they'll often share some insight on maybe how to bolster your application for a future grant cycle. So not to worry, even if it wasn't funded, there's some really good insights to glean from there. And then, often your work really gets into that implementation phase. You are working on putting all those things you put into the application into action. But from there, the grant funder is often looking for some outcome data. The reporting process is a really common part of this process. Often you will know in advance what information they're looking for, so you can really build that into your process and ensure you're getting the right data. But planning for that and really ensuring you can report out on that information. And just in terms of the timeline, every grant looks a little different, but most often grant cycles open in January, often awarded in mid to late spring, and that gives plenty of time so that folks can do that, robust training if that's a part of the plan sometime over the summer, late fall, and really kick the initiative off in the new school year.
Is that true of some of the grants that you mentioned that are tied to COVID relief funding? Or do they have a different timeline?
Yeah, a different timeline for that. That is a much more flexible timeline. The blog post I mentioned that our colleague Jordan Pasmentier put together gives a really great overview of the timeline for that, but the timeline is much broader. It basically dates back to anything at the start of the national emergency and can be spent out. It depends on which funding source, but can be spent out, I believe, through September of 2021 or September of 2022. But those dates are in there, and it's much broader. So this kind of grant cycle I'm speaking to is much more in line with things like private grants or state or local grants.
Okay.
Yeah, and one other thing to note, that's kind of coming to mind as you ask that question is that, again, every grant is very different, but thinking about if a grant is going to be an annual grant, so something you're going to need to reapply for, something that supports multi-year funding. So often that type of funding, federal funding, is something where you can build in multi-year planning. So you might be able to support a longer term sustainable initiative rather than having to reapply for something year after year. So just something for folks to think about from that sustainability sustainability perspective, all the better if you don't have to go through that application process year after year and can really write that in for multiple years in a row.
What are some of the important things to consider when applying for these grants?
Yeah, great question. So I think I mentioned this briefly about kind of the narrative or application part of the process, but I think starting with the why, really clearly outlining the need. I think for all those joining us today in this community, you already know the importance of this social emotional learning work, the importance of this for our students in our school communities. So really building that into the application itself. That will often live in what we call the need statement. So that's really where you're outlining the why and really making the case for this initiative. I also encourage you both in that part of the grant application as well as kind of woven throughout the entirety of the grant application process is to think about data, really weave that in where possible. That can be your own school data, really digging into the data you have or your district data. That can be the research and data around SEL more broadly. Committee for Children keeps a lot of really great and robust resources available to help give you numbers around this work, as does CASEL. So really turning to those sources to weave that in as well. And most importantly, and I think this is going to be already front of mind for folks, but to really center your students, to really ensure that they are the key component of this work, key component of the application, that you're really telling their story. When you're talking about the why, you're connecting it back to your students. When you're talking about outcomes, you are connecting it back to your students. So I would highly encourage that. I mentioned this a moment ago, but considering sustainability, if it is a one-year grant, funders will often want to know what comes afterwards. What will you do to continue this? We know that SEL is really most powerful when we can build it year after year and we can plan for those long-term initiatives. So if it is a one-year grant, what will you do when that funding runs out? Often, hopefully there is an opportunity to reapply, but they're going to want to hear that plan for sustainability. And then just kind of a technical thing for folks to keep front and center is really keeping those grant requirements in the front of your mind at all times. Kind of check and recheck that you have met all of those requirements, things like due dates, anything that they ask for to be included with the grant you have put in there. And even simple things like if the funder's focus is middle school age students, that you're really keeping it very focused and tailored to that age group. We want to make sure that if you are taking the time to put this together, that you are not rolled out because of a technicality in the grant requirements. So thinking about that. And then lastly, I just encourage you to think about your district team. Who are you collaborating with in this? It could be as simple as just connecting with a team in your billing or finance department in your district to just ensure they know what to do if the grant is awarded and you've kind of got that process already set up, or maybe working with the folks that might be helping you with reporting or implementing, but really having that collaborative effort from the start so everybody is ready with the hope that this funding is awarded, you are ready to go and you really have that team in place. And in turn, I think just if you are at a school level, ensuring that your school leaders are on board with this as well. I think we hear so often that our school leaders are so supportive of this work, but we know that they're going to be pivotal in the implementation process. So also ensuring their voice is a part of the application and kind of funding process as well is really pivotal too.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all this information with us, Joany, and I really appreciate it. This is kind of a black box, I think, for a lot of people, but there's a lot of opportunity here to help support social emotional learning.
Absolutely.
There's a bunch of resources that are in the chat for the video for the chat. If you haven't seen them yet, if you're looking for them, they will appear where you are shortly, and they'll also be with the recording as well. So we've got resources I've posted around policy papers you can use to explain the value of social emotional learning, grant databases from GrantWatch and CASEL, as well as information from Committee for Children on the recent funding opportunities from COVID relief, as well as a toolkit for grant writing from the Second Step program.
Wonderful. And before we wrap up, Matt, I was just going to share really briefly that our hope is that these conversations will continue with this series. So we started quite general in our conversation today, but I encourage folks to tune in for those future conversations to dive deeper in these funding topics. But I'm just so grateful for everyone who is working to identify funding for these SEL initiatives and really champion this. So thanks for having me today.
Of course, we're really grateful for you taking the time to join us here in the SEL education community, and we really look forward to having you join us again in a few months to talk more about SEL funding.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Joany. And of course, you don't need to wait 3 months to talk SEL funding. One of the things that caught my ear that Joany was saying, that one of the sources of information around where you can get funding is from fellow educators. And a great place to have these conversations is in the SEL education community. If you are in the SEL education community watching this right now, well, you're already there. So thank you very much for being a part of the community and joining. If you are not, if you're watching this somewhere else on Facebook or on Twitter or on YouTube, this is where you can find us. And we highly encourage you to come and join one of the largest, most active SEL communities of practice on the internet. And we would love to be able to continue the conversation around funding and all sorts of other things around social emotional learning. So once again, thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today, and we really appreciate it. Stay healthy, and we will see you down the road.